Well, good morning, fellowship. We are so excited about that, about the pop-up worship. We believe as a church family, God has called fellowship to the east side of Cleveland. We're part of the east side. God's called us to reach the east side, to continue to open up, be light in dark places. So I want to encourage you guys, seriously, to sign up, especially if you live in the Heights area. Grab somebody, bring them with you, and engage and enjoy this time of a pop-up worship. We were praying, the preaching team was having our preaching team meeting right there on the square when we were sitting there praying for divine appointments. And in that moment, immediately in that moment, two pastors, local pastors, came up to us and asked, "So where are you guys from? And what's going on?" And we said, we're just doing a pop-up worship. And they said, we need you here. And it's like, we just got done praying with it. So then we closed the Bibles and we went home because that was it. It was an amazing experience. It was that, so God is definitely in this, and we are just excited. So can't wait for you guys to participate in this and invite friends, and let's pack this place out for our pop-up worship night. So if you're new with us, we are on week 2 of our 2-week series called Hunger and Thirst. So we're looking at worship and what worship is. Specifically, we're answering the questions, what type of worship truly pleases God? What pleases God? Last week we mentioned that all of us here, come from a background, and many of us from a different background. Raise your hand if your background of worship is different than what we experience here each week. Just raise it high. Yeah, okay, so many of you guys know my background is Baptist. I grew up in this old Baptist church, and I'm just going to be honest, it was kind of an old stuffy Baptist background, and we're talking white pillars in front, the steeple up top, and all of that. Each and every week, we opened up the hymnal. And I'm not sure what happened, but if you guys remember, those of us who had hymnals back then that day, there was something that happened in the mid-'80s where the hymnals changed from the blue color to the pink color. You guys remember that? Some of you guys are nodding because you know exactly what I'm talking about. That was the kind of church that I was at. Like, that was a big deal because we changed the color of the hymnals. And not only that, but sometimes we would really cut loose and get a little crazy. And when it get a little nutty in there, we would break out the little thin book, which was the Maranatha Praise Choir songs. Again, if you're here and you have no idea what I'm talking about, you just don't know. If you grew up in my background, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It was a big, big deal, right? All of our worship backgrounds are different, and we were talking about when we come into a place like this, we all worship very differently. And it becomes very distracting at times, and we all come in with a certain approach in which we approach worship, and we think that's great here, that we all come in from these different backgrounds. Worship has always played a significant part in my life and in our family's life. It was actually a worship experience that kind of changed the trajectory for my wife and I and for our family. Years ago, probably back in the early 2000s, we had this experience. I was at a pastor at a little church, a little Baptist church in Troy, Ohio, down by Piqua and Dayton area. And it was a little looser Baptist, so I didn't have to wear my jacket and tie every single week. We had the Baptist-approved sweater vest, right? I think we got a picture of it. Go ahead and show the picture here. There it is. Now, a lot of this picture here is going to jump out at you. It's really important. One, maybe it's my soon-to-be 19-year-old daughter. She's all excited there at that time. My wife's pregnant with my second daughter, Geneva. I have hair, so that was something back then. And right there in the middle of all that, I've got my sweater vest. And I'll tell you what, a good collared shirt, the right collared shirt and a sweater vest is just as good as any shirt and tie here in Ohio, right? It's kind of how we roll. And so it was during that time, I was a pastor in Troy, Ohio, that we got an opportunity to go to a worship experience. And it sounded awesome because it was a guy named Eric Hauk. He was a concert cellist. And his wife, Britt, who was from that area, she was a harpist as well. And so we went down to Cincinnati to this old Catholic church. And it was exactly what you'd picture. We parked beside the church. We came in the small door, arched door, and we walked down the hallways. We're walking in the hallways. In my mind, as I remember torches, but I don't think it was because we have electricity. But in my mind, it was like torches. It was like dark. And then all of a sudden we go to there's this great big old library. And it was like, you got the stone, you've got the books, you've got all the woodwork all around. And it was this experience like, this is going to be awesome. Talk about a setting for worship. Me, appropriately dressed with my sweater vest, feeling very nice. I don't believe it was cold, but I was still wearing the sweater vest, right? So I'm in there. My wife looks great. We've got all of our friends. We've got my buddy who we went with was a worship pastor at our church. And then all of a sudden I saw this guy, Eric Hauk. And I'm not sure what jumped out at me first. He had torn jeans and no shoes. A t-shirt with a hole in it. It could have been the fact that he had his hair down to here, had eye piercings and things going on, had a beard that was braided into a braid all the way down his stomach. He's my age. His wife, Britt, looked similar. She did not have a beard, and I remember my first impression, I walked in and I'm like, wow, what amazingly worldly guy. I mean, I know that artists are eccentric, but you gotta look the part, seriously? Like this is, oh my gosh. Well, I remember sitting down, adjusting my sweater vest, thinking, I'm glad somebody showed up here dressed appropriately to worship at least. And I sat down. And then he started to play. And first he picks up a guitar, which really confused me because he's a cellist. And so when he picks up a guitar, I start thinking, this is going to be an interesting cello concert. As he sits there and he starts playing this very basic tune, just da 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 da, like just very, very basic. I'm like, oh great. Not only is it a guitar, but he's not a very good guitarist. And he's kind of recording it. And his wife, Britt, is out on the harp and she's playing a similar thing. And then all of a sudden they kind of step away and they had recorded what they were playing. And so it continued to loop. As he then walked over, I'm like, okay, what's going on? This is kind of weird. As then he walks over and he grabs his cello and he sits down. And the song's going dun da 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 dun da 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 da. And all of a sudden he starts playing. And I remember as soon as he hit the strings, I was like, holy cow. This is amazing. His wife, Britt, had left the harp at this point and playing the penny whistle with it as well. And now these two people were playing 4 instruments at the exact same time, and I was blown away by it. After the first song, they started to tell their story a little bit. And I learned that Eric grew up with and actually lived with a guy named Rich Mullins for years and years and years. Rich Mullins, many of you guys know, back in the 80s and 90s wrote songs like Our God is an Awesome God and Step by Step, and wrote half of Amy Grant's and Michael W. Smith's music and all of that. And he was a guy who lived with them for years and years and was under his tutelage for all of that time. And then I listened to their testimony, a testimony of God, how God took them from death to life. And I listened to their testimony of how God rescued them from a direction that they were headed and brought them into a new direction and into a new life. And I remember sitting there beside my wife and all of a sudden thinking about how amazingly constrictive my sweater vest was becoming. I felt like I just needed to crawl out of my sweater vest. And I thought in my mind, what an amazingly worldly guy am I? That I walk in, and in the first 2 minutes, I can summarize their entire life, their entire experience. I could summarize, what this was going to be like. And I tell you, that moment changed my life. Because in that moment, God began a journey of breaking down a judgmental heart that I had in my life. And from that day forward, I never looked at people the same since then. Whether you've been in church all of your life, you got a background like mine. I always say it was like Samuel, the prophet, who was brought in as a child. I said, I was raised in the church. Or maybe this is the first time you've ever stepped into church. Today, God wants you to take a few minutes to reflect and to evaluate on your worship. To evaluate your heart and to remove whatever barriers that you may have that's blocking you from truly worshiping God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, with all of your might. Last week we looked at an obscure passage of Scripture in 2 Samuel chapter 6. Turn with me to 2 Samuel chapter 6. We talked about King David. King David, it's this obscure passage where King David is bringing the Ark of the Covenant back into the presence of his people, of God's people, and it's a scene where he's dancing basically half naked in front of everybody in worship. Let's catch up with it in case you haven't read this yet. Starting in verse 12, it says, "Now King David was told that the Lord had blessed the household of Obed-Edom and everything that he has because of the ark of God." If you remember, the ark kind of went a little trip and ended up in this household of this guy named Obed-Edom. And so David went to bring the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with rejoicing. When those who were carrying the ark of the Lord had taken 6 steps, he sacrificed a bull and a fatted calf. Now again, I want to just paint the picture here. You've got a whole group of people coming, all of Israel's with them, and they literally are going, it's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. They stop, they bring a bull in, they kill the bull, they kill a fatted calf, they create an altar, they sacrifice it in worship right there. And then they take 6 more, and then they do it again. And then 6 more, and do it again. This was a long, slow procession of praise and worship from this household into the presence of God's people. When they were taking the 6 steps and sacrifice the bull and a fatted calf, David, wearing a linen ephod, we said it's like an underoos is what it was, which in that culture, that was basically dancing around naked. David was dancing before the Lord with all of his might, while he and all of Israel were bringing up the ark of the Lord with shouts and with sounds of trumpets. As the ark of the Lord was entering the city of David, Michal, daughter of Saul, watched from the window. When she saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, she despised him in her heart. It says David then took it and he brought the ark. He finally got into the presence of people. They did more sacrifices. And then he goes to the home, back to his home to bless his home. Verse 20, it says, "When David returned home to bless his household, Michal, daughter of Saul, came out to meet him and said, 'How the king of Israel has distinguished himself today, going around half naked in full view of the slave girls of his servants, like as any vulgar fellow would.' David said to Michal, 'It was before the Lord who chose me rather than your father or anyone from his household when he appointed me ruler over the Lord's people, Israel. I will celebrate before the Lord. I will become even more undignified than this, and I will be humiliated in my own eyes. But these slave girls who you spoke of, I will be held in honor.' And Michal, daughter of Saul, had no children from that day until her death." Last week we looked at this experience and we said, we got this king who's dancing half naked in front of all the people, and we asked a simple question: how in the world is this worship? We started to break down what worship was. We said, we gave 2 definitions. The first one was is to put our mind's attention and our heart's affection on God. The attention of our minds, the affections of our heart, placing it on God. Then we broke down the word. It's simple. I think it works great here, is taking the English word worship, and we just broke it down. The worth and ship is something that carries the worth of a thing, something that carries the worth of God. Specifically in this moment, we saw that what David was doing was David was making himself very low. He was stripping himself of the kingly, of the royalty, of the fact that this guy who was a shepherd, who now is the king, this one who was a giant killer, is now in front of everybody, and he was stripping that down to elevate God. He was putting himself in his place to place God in his place. If you're like me, the first time you've read through this passage, there's going to be a couple things that jump out at you that's a little bit strange. These were strange for me, at least. First one, of course, is what we've talked about, is the king dancing around naked. Okay, that's just a little weird in our culture, and so you look at that and you think, I don't understand what's going on. But we know that now how he was worshiping. The second thing that was strange to me was Michal's response. Now, what was strange to me wasn't the fact that she responded with, David, what are you doing here? You're dancing around naked. The thing that surprised me was the fact that her response wasn't appropriate, that her response wasn't the best thing. I mean, I think about it from her perspective. Picture this in your mind. Okay, a government official, one of the pastors. This is even better. Your spouse, your mom or dad. Okay, national TV, dancing around in their underwear, and then saying it's okay, it's all worship. Imagine that, right? Your stomach kind of turns a little bit here when you're thinking about that. And yet the response that was given, it says that as a result of her response, Michal, daughter of Saul, had no children until the day of her death. Whether that means that God stopped that or David had nothing to do with her. I find it odd that one little critique about one worship experience would cause so much trouble. Picture in your minds how many times we walk out of a worship experience with an opinion as to how worship was. That's how we say it. Worship was good. Worship wasn't. And we have an opinion how worship was. Interesting, most commentators agree that this is the first place in the Bible where we see somebody critiquing somebody else's worship. Something that now has become second nature to most church attenders start off as a life-altering event. So let's take a couple minutes here. I want to look at the question. Answering the question is, what's really Michal's problem? What's really Michal's problem in this situation? Again, you got to get the picture of what's going on. You've got the band coming, and she's standing up there looking down from her queenly tower, looking at all the people coming. And I picture this scene as she's trying to get a glimpse of the presence of God, the ark of God coming back to his people. It's been gone for a long time, and now it's coming back. And she has that experience that only some of us get the chance to have this. If you're like me and 4'3", you get this experience. When you go see a movie and like somebody tall sits right in front of you, and the whole time you're like, and they kind of move their head, and you kind of, so I'm picturing Michal sitting there from her queenly tower looking out, trying to see the ark of God, and as she's looking out, all of a sudden, you get this crazy guy jumping right in her way. And then she's looking over here for it, and all of a sudden this crazy guy jumps over to this side, and she's sitting there irritated and aggravated, this guy who's leaping and dancing around, distracting her, blocking her view of the presence of God, and all of a sudden she thinks, oh my goodness, that's my husband. Right? Have you had that experience? You know, maybe a spouse or maybe a mom or dad, you come into a ball, I had this all the time growing up. You come into a ball game or something and you've got some lunatic in the stands hooping and hollering and yelling, and you're thinking, what kind of, oh my goodness, that's my dad. And you stop for a second, and it's all right, it's embarrassing until you have to go sit beside them, right? And then all of a sudden it's taken to a whole new level. She's looking out there and she's like, oh my goodness. Only it says it takes it a step further. It says that she wasn't embarrassed. So much deeper than this, it says that she despised him in her heart. That seems really serious to me. See, Michal's problem wasn't that she was embarrassed. I think it wasn't that she was distracted. Her problem was the fact that she missed the presence of God joining the people. She missed God because she was in the way. See, it was her heart, her attitude, the baggage that she has in her life blocked her from seeing and experiencing God. I think these are three things that we see that block worship. There are three things that can block worship that we see in this passage right here. The first one, the word despise that she said, that we see here. She says she despised him in her heart. The Hebrew word means to disdain, to scorn. It means to hold in contempt. It's a picture, it's got this feeling of this picture of an authoritarian or a judge who stands right there over in judgment as to what they're seeing. The very first thing that we see when David comes in and Michal comes, the first thing we don't see is we don't see her say, oh, so, the ark's back, this is great. She doesn't say, so how was the journey? Did you have enough cows? Things like that. You remember the last time this journey happened, somebody died. They touched the ark. She didn't say, did anybody touch the ark this time? Nothing like that. What you see, the first thing she says is she comes in and she stands in judgment over how he was worshiping. The very first thing that happens. You see, Michal's problem is that her critical heart blocked her from seeing God. She enters the worship scene with a picture in her mind how the king should be acting, how the people should be acting, how God should be acting. She has a critical heart. You ever entered into a situation where you've got a little bit of an attitude when you come into it? Maybe you had to go somewhere. You didn't really want to be there. Maybe you have to, you're with somebody you don't necessarily want to be with, and so you got kind of a bad attitude. And what happens? That attitude kind of then taints everything, right? Everything about the experience is bad, is wrong, because you kind of came into it with a little bit of an attitude. All of a sudden, it's way too cold, or it's way too hot. It's too loud. It's not nearly loud enough. I can't even hear it. People are way too friendly. People seem fake. This is way too real for me. It taints everything. And all of a sudden, all you see it is from this critical heart. Let me tell you, a critical heart will block worship faster than anything else. You see, it's impossible to worship God with a critical heart. It's impossible to carry his goodness, his greatness, his grace, to reflect who he is, and yet the whole time harbor a critical heart. Scriptures say, Jesus addresses this all the time. He says, be careful when you walk into situations and all of a sudden you're just picking at the speck in somebody else's eye, picking at these little things when the whole time you have a log in your own eye. Be careful of entering into it with that attitude. The Proverbs are filled with descriptions of a heart that's rotten with bitterness and a critical spirit, and how it erodes relationships and friendships, and how it burrows into our lives and destroys it from the inside out. In worship, it looks like this. Today's worship was all right. Oh, I love that song. Too bad they had to wear that. I love it in our Facebook age. It's like, okay, I give the place a 5 on friendliness, a 3 on music, but only a 2 on engagement. Or sometimes we crouch it in a more hidden way. We feel bad. Oh man, that was an amazing worship time. I cannot believe that guy could not just stand there and just raise his hands up the whole time. We got to be real careful of a critical heart, because a critical heart blocks worship. Jesus says this in Matthew 15. He's quoting Isaiah 29. He says, these people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. He says you can actually show up each and every week and say the right things, sing the right things. You can come in and do all of the right things, but if your heart is not where it should be, if your heart is not in a posture of worship, guess what? Your worship, well, he says, it's actually not worship at all. It's in vain. Jesus says we got to be careful. You can't worship with a critical heart. So what if instead of criticizing, what if we keep the focus and the attention and the direction on God? Not what we want. What if when we worship God, when we praise him, when we offer our lives even throughout the week with a thankful heart, we choose to keep the attention of that moment on what's pure, what's true, what's noble, what's right, and we give the attention on the one who deserves this instead of what we want in that moment. You might discover that your critical heart begins to shift and change. It's keeping the attention where it belongs, on him instead of on us. Because actually, when we're worshiping, we don't carry our agenda, we don't carry our glory, we carry his. We see this again in this passage here. We see Michal take it actually even a step further than that, with a self-absorbed attitude. And listen to her critique here. She says, oh, how the king of Israel distinguished himself today, going around half naked in full view of the slave girls of his servants, as any vulgar fellow would. And David's response to her is, oh, okay, wait a second, listen here. It was before the Lord that I celebrated. Her self-absorbed attitude calls her to stand and do this. In that moment, to stop and just to spend her time looking around. Her self-absorbed attitude caused her to be concerned with everyone else was thinking and seeing and experiencing. See, there are certain things in her life that she probably wanted everybody to see, and certain things that we don't want everybody to see. But to my best guess, in this passage, nowhere do we see where she wanted to see what God was thinking of the whole situation. Instead, she brings accusations of what everyone else is thinking, and but her embarrassment goes beyond just a misunderstanding. I mean, the idea of a shepherd boy running around in his underwear, dancing and stuff like that probably is not too crazy, right? Up to this point, David has spent most of his life spending all of his time as a shepherd with the sheep and out in the fields. But it's not how a king should act. Her issue flowed from a self-absorbed attitude. Have you ever talked with somebody before and all of a sudden like you're having a conversation and they kind of blow up on you? And you've got enough self-awareness that you walk away and you're like, okay, that was probably not me. That was probably something that they're dealing with. And they just took it out on me. I think that's what we see here with Michal. I think her blowing up on David had a lot less to do with David himself and a lot more to do with what's going on in her heart. A self-absorbed attitude will block worship every time because you can't worship God and be self-absorbed. It just makes sense. You can't have all of your attention, worship, you can't have all of your attention, all of your praise, all of your direction facing to God and yet putting yourself there as well. You can't be worshiping God, lifting him up as the most important, and yet keeping yourself in the center as well. And this is really, really tough for everybody in this room. I know it is, because we all grew up, we all live in a self-consumed world. You see, from the very beginning of our life, we've learned that the customer is always right. Right? Because you live in America, you grew up right here, and so we've learned, this is what we've experienced, is that the customer's all right. We see this when it comes to stores, we see it when it comes to restaurants, and a lot of times it creeps into, we see it in what people approach church and their experience here as well. I mean, we pay the bills. If we don't like this, we just go to somewhere else. Unfortunately, this goes beyond theology and disagreement and how we interpret scriptures, but for most places it involves things like the color of paint, the coffee, the programs that are offered, the music that's played. We know it because it's called consumerism. And everyone in the room understands it because, again, it's birthed in us. The problem is that the heart of consumerism is me. The center of consumerism is me. I'm right there in the middle of it. And I'm the most important thing. And you see the problem with that when it comes towards worship? It's a self-absorbed attitude. You have to remove yourself from the center of attention. It's hard. But what if instead of a self-absorbed attitude, we made the choice when you enter into a place of worship, when you enter to this moment before God, if you actually told yourself, I'm going to turn my heart and my attitude and my attention all towards, I'm going to direct everything I have, I'm going to consciously make the choice to just focus there. I told the first service, the last thing I pray almost every single time when I come up here on stage, it's become a pattern of my life now. As I walk up, I come up with, and I say one prayer. It's very short, sweet. God knows what I mean by it. I say, God, help me not mess up this message. And I say it not because of me. He knows what I mean. What I mean by that is, God, you've got a message that's given. You've got a message that you've prepared. You've got a message that has to be delivered. Get me out of it, so that the message can be delivered. Because I can mess it up. What if when we came into a time of worship, we said, God, literally, this is all about you. Not about me, not about what I want. It's hard. And it's hard because many of us come here each and every week with the baggage that we carry Monday through Saturday. The life experiences and the baggage that is built into our lives, and we show up to a time with all of this background, all of these things come together, and we carry this baggage, but guess what? Unresolved baggage can block you from seeing God. It's exactly what I think happened here with Michal. I think it roots back to her unresolved baggage. Listen to this in verse 21. In verse 21, it says, she gives her rebuke, or her rebuke of David, and his response was this: "It was before the Lord who chose me rather than your father or anyone else from this house when he appointed me ruler over the Lord's people Israel. Me, David, I will celebrate the Lord." You ever been in a conversation where there's like an issue that's going on, when you've been like, you're listening into another couple, they're sitting down, you're having this conversation, and all of a sudden you hear them kind of bickering and fighting. You know it's an issue. You're not going to ask them if it's an issue. They're not going to tell you if it's an issue, but you know it's an issue just by the way they talk. And you just kind of this awkward moment, when all of a sudden, he's like, well, if you had taken the promotion like we said we would have, then we wouldn't have this problem. And you're just kind of standing there like, this is kind of awkward. This is a situation with David. It's like she comes in with this rebuke, and out of nowhere, David's like, listen, God chose me, not your dad, not anyone else in your family, to be the king. And at first you're like, what in the world does this have to do with anything? She's rebuking you for jumping around in your underwear dancing. Well, obviously there's something there. Last week we talked about sometimes you got to know the context of the situation to kind of get the full picture. Let me give you just a little bit of the context of this of the life story of Michal. Many of you guys know that Michal was Saul's daughter. It says it again and again. This the daughter of Saul, the daughter of Saul. You guys remember David and Goliath. When whoever defeated the giant was going to get the daughter of Saul. He meant the first daughter of Saul. After David, the shepherd boy, defeated Goliath, basically Saul reneged on it. He kind of recanted and he gave his firstborn daughter to someone else who was more worthy of that. And eventually, Michal then became David's wife instead. Now, first, she loved David, but the problem was that, again, with Saul and David, they were just constantly hitting heads. Do you guys remember the more popular David got, the more Saul was trying to kill him? I mean, he goes straight for it. Like, he just wants him out of there. So he's going to kill him. And time again, this is happening. And then all of a sudden, there's a picture where they're at home, and David's at home with Michal, and all of a sudden, Saul had hired a bunch of hired thugs to break in and kill David in his sleep. But Michal, she had heard of the plot ahead of time, and so she snuck David out the window, and he got away. She took her own hair, she cut her hair, she put it into the bed, and it's that scene you see in every movie, like where the guys come in and they're beating up the pillows, That's what it was. They come in and they're stabbing, and all of a sudden, but he wasn't there. And she saved him. And then Saul found out. And Saul came back. And he just pulls on the mother of all guilt trips that could be. He's like, you chose this shepherd boy over your king. You chose a shepherd boy over your own flesh and blood, your father. I cannot believe that you would, and he starts pouring this out. And she actually blames it. She goes, well, David made me do this. And she makes, and it says from that moment on, there was a break that starts to happen in the relationship between David and Michal. If you know the story of David, he then spends quite a few years on the run where Saul's trying to track him down. Well, it's not really great for their marriage for him to be on the run, so she actually marries somebody else, a neighboring ruler in that area. It ends up being a great marriage in the fact that they both love each other, and it's supposed to fit perfect, except for the fact, of course, that she was already married to David. And so in the middle of all of this, King Saul dies, and that kind of changes the situation for David, and he becomes the king. And then he goes back and he gets her and forcibly brings her back into the home. Like I said, there's something there. There's a backstory to it. We forget that people are the way they are for a reason. It's a phrase I use all the time. When we see people, it's so fast, it's easy for us to judge, easy for us to summarize them very quickly, but we forget that people are the way they are for a reason. We forget that it's the baggage of life, it's our childhood, our experiences, the wins and the losses of who we are that make up how we respond in most situations. It's interesting in this story, you actually, as you're reading it, you can miss the presence of God. The whole point of the story is that the presence of God is coming back to his people, but you get caught up in the story and all the drama and all the craziness that's going on. You get distracted by the craziness of the thoughts of who's right and who's wrong and who here is just plain crazy. See, unresolved baggage does this. The burden of unresolved baggage can block you from seeing God. Unresolved baggage causes you to feel like a victim. Unresolved baggage in your life causes you to need to prove yourself right again and again and again. When you have unresolved baggage in your life, you walk around with this crushing guilt. Unresolved baggage in your life can cause you to want to give up altogether. And in doing that, unresolved baggage can cause you just to totally miss the presence of God. See, Michal's problem was that she was a little too much like her father. Everything that King Saul did, everything that he did in his life was to make himself look like the king, to make himself into this position. And everything we see in David in this moment is David is trying to bring himself down to raise up his God. I was finishing the message, and I literally got to this part of this message, and then it just hit me. Something that I'd missed. I've read this passage many times before, but I just kind of jumped over it. It goes back to verse 15. It says, while David and all of Israel were bringing the ark of the Lord with shouts of trumpets, as the ark of the Lord was entering the city of David, Michal, daughter of Saul, watched from a window. Anybody find that strange? If all of Israel is there, if the presence of God is moving to be with his people, now she may not be down there dancing around and doing all of that, but wouldn't you think that she would want to be down close to the presence of God? Maybe walking as close as she can. Maybe, wouldn't you think that she would want to be down in the middle of this worship experience? But instead, a critical heart, self-absorbed attitude, all this baggage, it kept her from even entering into the presence of God. Entering to be right down in the middle of how would the story have been written differently if she would have dropped that stuff off? If she would have let go of a critical heart, made it not her job to critique and to pick and to try to. If she would stop and in that moment say, this is God coming back to his people and I'm part of his people, so I'm going to turn my heart and my attention and I'm going to focus on him. How would it be written differently if she took all of the junk in her life, like we all have got, and she just takes it and she just kind of dumps it down and says, I'm leaving that there for now. See, I think about that with us. Have we been honoring God with our lips and yet our hearts are far from him? Because we can do that. And David needed to strip himself from that kingly image. I needed to take off the sweater vest, right? The judgmental attitude and the judgmental heart where I critique everything. Where are you guys at? Do you feel like maybe just by yourself you sit down and you just adjust that sweater vest nice when you need to just take it off? Where do you need to be freed this morning? God's calling you to give up something, to be freed up, to worship him with all that we have. Let's take the last few minutes here and let's do this together.